Welcome to Unchatted Waters. In this episode, we talk about the colour of pollution. We discuss the sources of marine pollution, from the chemicals found to some of the impacts on systems such as food webs. We explore detection, monitoring, indicators, and global objectives that contribute to prioritising where we can take action to reduce the harm to our ocean. Welcome to Unchatted Waters, the podcast that talks to the people behind the science. I'm Kirsty, your host, and I'm excited to introduce my two guests for today's episode. Michelle Devlin is a principal pollution scientist. Working across marine pollution topics for 25 years, her work extends from coastal ecosystems to monitoring programs across the globe. Andy Smith is a principal ecotoxicologist. His research explores how chemicals affect marine animals and plants, and their interaction with their environment. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. So I want to start with you, Andy, as an ecotoxicologist. Can you explain what that is and what marine pollution is, please?
Ecotoxicology is the science of looking at things that live in the environment and how pollution affects them. By pollution, I'm referring to various chemicals that enter the environment, contaminate it, and then the polluting ones are the contaminants that have a harmful effect. There are lots of different contaminants, lots of things enter the marine environment through human action, whether they're produced by humans or for humans or as a byproduct of humans. They are all chemicals. Some of them are nutrients, so they're chemicals that increase growth and enhance growth of populations or growth of individuals. Things that people are perhaps quite familiar with, like heavy metals like lead and cadmium, chemicals from oil, so oil spills and oil burning. And there are chemicals that we use in a positive way for ourselves, so pharmaceutical products, aspirin, paracetamol, things like caffeine. And when they hit the environment, they're designed to have an impact on things that are living. So when they arrive in the marine environment, they have an impact on the things that are living there. What we think of as contamination is chemicals that are there that wouldn't be there without human intervention. And then pollution is those contaminants having an adverse effect, so making something worse than it would have been if they weren't there.
So the difference between contamination and pollution. Contamination is chemicals arriving in an environment where they might not have been seen before, and then pollution is that they are, and those contaminants are a negative impact.
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Okay. Great, thanks for clarifying that. I didn't know there was a difference between contamination and pollution. I just kind of lumped them together.
And they're used more or less interchangeably if you move outside of science. But I think as scientists, it helps us to think about them in those two ways. So there's all sorts of things that contaminate until we've seen them do something negative. They're not a pollutant.
Thank you for that summary. So Michelle, in terms of pollution, what are the main sources of that pollution that's creating that negative impact in the environment?
Well, as Andy said, I think main sources of pollution are all human induced. So it is usually what we're doing to the environment in some way that creates pollution. Marine pollution specifically, 80% of marine pollution is land-based. So it's something that happens on the land and it goes into the sea. So a lot of the solutions, which we'll talk about a bit later, actually have to happen a long time before the pollution actually gets to the sea. Pollution has been happening for hundreds of years, something that humans are doing. A lot of it is that there is a lot of humans, and so we end up doing things that create a high intensity of a particular activity. Things like sewage go into our rivers and into our waterways and then into the seas. We also have agriculture, and we can have a lot of runoff from agriculture. Now, these are all necessary things. We need agriculture. So there's a real balance about trying to support the activity and then also what is the solution to ensure that there's not too much pollution that comes from it. But we do also have other types of pollution, such as ship-based pollution. So that's still very much a very significant activity. And then we can also think about things like oil spills, which Angie has mentioned, which tend to happen at sea as well. There's lots of different ways, and we've been doing it for a very long time. But we hopefully keep moving forward and thinking about what are the solutions around fixing up marine pollution.
Okay, so once one of these pollutants, for example, nutrients off agriculture, get into the marine environment, what are the impacts? Because Andy mentioned that pollution is an adverse impact. So what is some of those impacts?
Nutrients are a specific type of pollution, marine pollution. Now, nutrients come off land. They come from sewage, they come from agriculture. Nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, what they do is, Andy said, they enhance growth. The little plants in the ocean called phytoplankton, they take up nutrients. They need nutrients anyway, so we always have nutrients. But when you have too many nutrients, you get accelerated growth. When you get accelerated growth, that's when you start to see undesirable disturbances. You get high growth and then you get die-offs and then you get declines in oxygen. So these are all things that can affect the animals that are actually living in the sea. So that's a process called eutrophication.
So I guess in simple terms, it's an imbalance. So food webs that are already present in the marine environment, they are used to using nutrients that are around. They're in part of an important process which we rely on, such as our food and primary production. So adding nutrients kind of throws it off balance. So one is growing a little bit more and then it kind of just throws everything off balance, I guess.
And that's a good way to say it, that the system working the way it should work. When we add additional elements such as too many nutrients, we cause that imbalance. And we also, the types of nutrients can cause imbalances. So if you have, let's just say, too much nitrogen and not enough phosphorus, then that causes a very specific type of impact on the phytoplankton. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment trying to understand those imbalances and the impacts they can have, which can be a very extended impact because the phytoplankton are at the basis of the food web. So when they start to change, it can affect everything.
So Michelle's mentioned some of the impacts on food webs and some of the sources of marine pollution. So Andy, I want to ask you, how do we measure the extent of that impact? Is it categorised into certain groups?
I mean, you can measure the extent of it in anything that it's having an impact on, but some of them are easier to work with and some of the impacts are easier to see. So if you're trying to get the most value for money, you work with things where you know there's a measurable impact and you know that you can easily see that impact and measure it and quantify it. Picking up from what Michelle was saying, there is always going to be something limiting the growth of a population of anything, phytoplankton or animals. And that could be space, it could be temperature, it could be the chemicals in the environment, it could be competition from other things. So what we're interested in is the impacts from chemicals in particular and polluting chemicals in particular. So with animals, that can be a whole range of different things, from death, the most obvious one and perhaps the easiest to measure, but it can be a change in reproductive rate, it can be a change in the sex ratio when the reproduction is successful, it can be a change in the rate that things grow, it can be subtle changes that affect one species more than another, so you start seeing a different species starting to dominate in the environment, which then has knock-on effects on the food chain, which we've already sort of talked about. So impacts are not always clearly linked to the chemical causing them, because some of the impacts relate to general poor health of the animal or plant you're thinking about. So there could be a variety of families of chemicals that make things generally not as healthy as they were. They might be putting more energy into their liver processing chemicals. They might be putting more energy into growing because now they're not capable of growing as well. So when you get these poor health impacts, you can measure them, you can see them, you could quantify them, but you don't necessarily know what the chemical is that's causing it.
Okay, so in contrast to what Michelle was talking about, she's talking about the sources to the ocean, and then I suppose you're talking about understanding, you've noticed an impact, the creature or animal is doing something you didn't expect, and then you're backtracking to understand what's causing it. So you're kind of meeting in the middle. So the different chemicals that are having these adverse impacts are one thing. We know some of them. I mean, we probably have detailed knowledge of maybe sort of 500 or so chemicals, but there's estimated to be over 100,000 different chemicals in use. So we only know a lot about very few of them. And so
For the chemists, they're measuring the ones that we know are harmful, where we have limits set or we know that they might be increasing in the environment. As a toxicologist, what we're trying to do is sometimes we measure those chemicals specifically. So if we know a chemical is going to be used in the marine environment, we can test it in the lab and say it's going to be harmful at these concentrations.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we can measure parts of the marine environment. We can take a water sample, we can take a sediment sample, and we can put animals or plants into those and see how they respond. And what they're responding to is the sum total of every chemical in that sample. So some will be having positive things. There might be nutrients in there that help them to grow faster. There might be industrial chemicals that slow them down or change their reproduction. So with this enormous cocktail of chemicals, how can we possibly calculate what's going on? If you're looking at the effects on animals or plants, you can see what's going on and say, we're not sure what chemicals are causing this, but this population is struggling, or these things can no longer reproduce, or these things aren't growing as much as they used to. And then from that, you can perhaps find where your areas of concern are, the hotspots of pollution, if you like. And then you can start doing some more targeted chemical analytical work to say, well, okay, we know there's something here that's causing a problem. We'll just start working through the usual suspects and then perhaps going further to try and work out what's causing this impact.
What I'd add to Andy is, which I think is really important, that if we were to do this work 100 years ago, it might be that we had a very specific pollution problem. There might be some big industry, and we wouldn't have known, but might have been just one or two chemical coming out from that particular industry, or that we knew that it was nutrients. Now we're working in systems that face a lot of cumulative pressures.
Right.
So it is really hard sometimes to think what is the actual thing that is doing the damage, if there is damage, if we are, as Andy said, if we're measuring an impact. So a lot of our work is trying to almost backtrack, as you were just saying, to understand if we're seeing the impact, what is it that is actually doing the thing that makes the impact happen. And then on top of all of that, we have to deal with a changing climate as well, which puts its own pressures. And so what you end up having is a system that is very different from what it used to be. And we're trying to understand what are the main activities. So in the end, when we make the decisions, what's the priority thing to do that helps that system the most? And that can sometimes be a really hard question to answer. Maybe a lot of things need to happen quite quickly.
Right. So how do you start to unpick? Because I'm assuming the baseline is hard to determine as well, because we weren't taking the kind of measurements that we're taking now. Science is always progressing. We're always taking more measurements. We're understanding the world more and more. And I guess 100 years ago, we had a different understanding, or it wasn't being recorded. So you might not have that baseline. So how do you start to unpick kind of all these cumulative effects that are having an impact on the marine environment? Where do you even start?
We do have a baseline, actually. We have models. So we can develop a model now based on current conditions. So let's just say we model the rivers and how much nutrients are coming out into the ocean. But then we can look at 100 years ago, and we've done this exactly, and then looked at if we took away, say, a lot of the nutrients because there was far less agriculture and it was a completely different system. And then we ran that same model, and that would help us understand what we would have expected to see 100 years ago.
Right.
And if the model was being fairly accurate now, we could then start to understand that was the baseline, this is the difference. And so then we could start to say, this is a good ecological state 100 years ago, and we might never get back to 100 years ago, but at least it gives us a direction of travel to say where we might want to head towards.
Like an objective and a target to get
exactly.
to. Yeah, because I was thinking when you were describing, it seems quite difficult to even know where to start, because, the ocean is one big, mixing pot of animals and nutrients and systems and circulation and temperature and pollutants.
Which is why having indicators is really important. There's lots and lots of indicators, and we use them in our monitoring program. We follow those. And we think if we're moving towards a desired state, that's good. If we're moving away from it, then we need to take some action. And so those indicators are often based on our understanding of what used to be there, or hopefully in some ways where the systems are doing really well, and we can say, okay, that's where we want to be, and to make sure we don't divert away from it.
Okay, so it's like a yardstick. You're kind of
Absolutely.
aiming towards it.
Yeah.
So can you describe what one of those indicators might be? Is it a measurement in the environment, or is it kind of a model output that you're working towards based on, a time series? What does that actually
all
look
of those
like?
things actually. A very simple one. A very simple one is just the concentration of winter nutrients.
Okay.
So we have a value for that. And so then when we measure winter nutrients, then we go out between November and February, because that's when nutrients are the highest. We then compare what we measure to that threshold of winter nutrients. And then we also have a value for, say, chlorophyll, which is an indication of the phytoplankton. And then we have a value for dissolved oxygen. So they are all related to the term I said before about eutrophication. Andy has different indicators if he was talking about ecotoxicology.
So if you're talking about animals in the environment, we look at a type of flatfish called a dab. So we measure a number of different things on that to see how it's changing over time and geographically. So we might look at evidence of cancer, we look at evidence of liver damage, we look at the amount of parasites they're carrying, we look at the size at which they reach sexual maturity, the sex ratio. So there's all sorts of things we can measure, and over time, and these things take time, you need 10 plus years of data before you can really start to get a feel for which direction things are trending, whether things are getting worse or better. We use those to represent what might be happening to other fish and other organisms in the environment. So if we focus on one species or a few species, we get very proficient in understanding subtle differences in those. And then we can say those subtle differences will be happening in other species as well to a greater or lesser extent. So we might be looking at dab, which are not a particularly highly valued commercial catch, but we can use that data to try and understand some things that might be happening to cod, to whiting, to the various other things that we do value without having to catch vast amounts of them to see what's going on. So they're indicators, they're sentinel organisms that we use.
So what does sentinel mean?
Sentinel, it's the thing that gives you an early warning. So it's an organism that you're looking at, as we talked about earlier. We're looking at this thing not because necessarily we're worried about this particular organism, but if something happens to this organism, it's probably happening to everything else as well, as a measure of other changes that are happening to other things. We're using them to measure, hopefully, positive change, but sometimes the news is not so good, and then it's a measure that something's happening in the environment that's driving them into a situation of ill health.
You need to take action.
And we need to do something.
Yeah. Because people who are catching and eating dab, it's not because they're accumulating all of these kind of chemicals in the marine environment. They're just a species that you've picked for certain reasons. So why have you picked the dab?
There are lots and lots of discussions about what to use as sentinel organisms, and so these are ones that are for the OSPAR area of the North Atlantic.
Sorry, what's OSPAR?
Full name is the Oslo-Paris Commission. It's 16 countries around the Northeast Atlantic who would all like to, or have all seen the value in getting together to try and manage the area as a whole, because that's how oceans work, rather than trying to manage it on a country-by-country basis. So they try and work together to come up with ways of behaving that maintain or improve the status of the ocean, rather than each doing actions selfishly which might affect the country next to them. They have a number of activities, things that they're interested in,
that lots of countries are kind of working towards. Then you're all working together towards, those top 5 priorities.
Yeah, and that's where the selection of some of these sentinel species comes from. So it's trying to choose species that have meaning to all the different countries. Not all of the sentinel species cover all of those areas, but we try and make sure that there's enough overlap, that there's some meaning, and we can read all the way down from north to south and east to west in the region.
So I want to come back to you, Michelle, and talk about those indicators. Is that across different, like weather stations, or is it a survey you're going out when you're talking about your winter indicators? How are you actually doing that?
We collect all of this information through monitoring programs, and we have UK-based monitoring programs. The one that I'm specifically interested in and is the marine pollution, like water quality. monitoring programs, and we collect data and have done so for many years in a variety of different ways. So we have a research ship that goes out quite regularly. We collect water quality samples from that ship, but we also have a lot of equipment on that ship that collects data all the time, and this is called autonomous data. So there's equipment on the ship that runs all the time, and it tells us different things at very high frequency. But we also have what we call smart buoys, and we have 2 from out of the Thames and 1 in Liverpool Bay. And what these are, they're fixed monitoring stations, and we collect a lot of data on them using a variety of instruments. And we collect data about water, and we collect data on plankton, and we collect data on weather. But that's being collected all the time. And then we bring all of this data back. Either we go to the smart buoy and we collect things that have been collected on the smart buoy, and we just have a lot of data that we then need to do something with. And a lot of that is actually making sure that we validate the data, so make sure that the data that we're collecting is correct and precise. And then once we have that, we start to put all this data together, in some ways like a big jigsaw puzzle. And then we bring it all together and we try to say something about the state of the marine environment from all of that data. And when we collect that data over long term, as Andy was mentioning before, it helps us to start understand, is the system changing? Right. And if it's changing, is it changing in a positive way or in a negative way? And also, very importantly, once we have that information, to start working with all the other different agencies and all the other different people and all the stakeholders to say, what is it that we can do that can help mediate that problem?
Okay.
And that's a big part of our job, collecting the information, collecting the data, so we can tell the story that helps us actually do something about it.
So one follow-up question I had for you was, when you go over to your smart buoy, are you downloading data from it, like plugging in a USB, and then the rest of the data is kind of beaming up via satellite? Or is it your buoy is collecting water samples, which then you're taking back to the lab and measuring?
So there are bag samples on the smart buoy, so it does collect water samples, specially treated so they can stay there for a little while before we would come and pick them up. Then we also have different ways of collecting that autonomous data that gets collected by sensors. And so the sensors will be in the water, and water might be rushing past the sensors, and the sensors will be doing different things. They might be measuring the colour of the water, something that's in the water. They might be measuring weights of some of the suspended particulate matter that's in the water.
Wow.
So it's all different things, and how we collect it is all different ways. So yes, some of it is beamed back, some of it is collected on a boat. We also do a lot of work on smaller boats as well, collaborating with a lot of the other different government agencies. So we go out in small boats and we collect data right inshore. So we sort of, like, if that's where the pollution issues are most going to be, they're going to be inshore. And then finally, we also have models, as we talked about before. And then we have, and this is more in the last 20 years, we do have satellites in the sky, and we do collect data from those satellites about what's in the water. And we bring all of those things together. And that's sometimes the hardest job then, what to do with all the data that you have.
Yeah, of course. So I suppose you're going to the coastlines where the concentration might be highest, yes, and comparing that to maybe offshore smart buoys to understand how that concentrated pollutant has reached the wider marine environment.
We do a lot of work using mapping and modelling and the water quality data that we collect to look at that gradient of change, right, because you would expect a lot of the biggest water quality issues will happen in the estuaries, in the coastal waters, and what we call plume waters, which is the extent of the river. So we map that river extent, and it's called a river plume. And so when you're looking at water quality issues, you're most likely to see them in those areas. Then as you move beyond that, you will see different types of issues. But yes, you could go offshore and compare that value with your inshore and see how different is that. People get very worried about the pollution they can see, and that is marine litter. But because marine litter is visible, you can at least talk about it with people. A lot of the other pollution we've mentioned today is not visible.
So let's talk about detection a little bit more. And we've talked about monitoring, and we've talked about your smart buoys, but I want to think about when you're in the lab, Andy, and you've got a water sample. How can you detect the chemicals in the water? You can't see it potentially. What kind of tools do you have in the lab to detect? For example, do you have like litmus paper for acidity? So is there
Pretty
something
much.
similar to that? Or is it a funky kind of machine that's going to tell you, oh, you've got phosphorus? Or
It's spread across a number of disciplines. Some of them are very small, relatively inexpensive bits of kit. Quite a large proportion of the equipment that's used to measure things chemically in the marine environment are in the £100,000 mark or above. You need to make sure that you're investing that money wisely and buying something that's actually going to help and it's going to make a big difference to what you're doing.
Yeah.
Electrochemical detection, so changes in what's in the water, changes the sort of voltage of a sensor, and you use that to detect what's in there. If you pump your sample down a very, very thin capillary tube, the size of the chemical molecule will affect how fast it moves down that tube, and you record how long it takes before it pops out the other end.
Oh.
And as you start seeing peaks, the time that they come out tells you what sort of chemical it is that's coming out, and you get a number of peaks. It's a very simplified approach. Then if you're a chemist, what you do is you take the chemicals as they come out and you smash them in some way against some sort of detector. And that identifies what the chemicals are that are coming out. And it does it either by identifying the whole chemical, or you break it into pieces, and then you can identify those pieces, and you're like, well, I know what those pieces make up. Some of it's done through colour, different colours that are produced from different reactions. So you add chemicals to your sample, and the chemicals will change colour depending on what's in the sample, and you can read that colour change and quantify whether there's a particular chemical in, and a rough estimate of what sort of concentration is in there.
The lab-based equipment is also improving the sensors that we use at sea.
Now, you mentioned colour of pollution. You mentioned the colour that the sensor is detecting. How is it looking at the colour of the ocean?
So the really simplest way to explain this is that if you were looking at a river discharging into the sea and there was a lot of sediment in the river, the water would be brown. And you'd be able to see that very clearly. So there'd be a brown river discharge against potentially blue ocean water around it. Now, if there's a lot of nutrients in the water and you get a lot of plankton growing quite fast, the water would be green.
Okay.
And so there's brown, there's green, and there's about 10,000 different colour variations of that. And those different colour variations mean something different. So the more brown the water is, obviously the sediment is the issue. So if you were then monitoring that and saw a lot of sediment, and that might be impacting on your seagrasses, maybe on your, if you were worried about coral reefs, if we're somewhere else, it would be coral reefs. So then you would go back upstream and start to look at activities that you could reduce your sediment loss.
Right.
But if the water was green a lot and you start to think, actually, it's very highly productive, there's lots of plankton in there, and that has a whole another set of impacts, that probably means there's too many nutrients coming in the water.
Okay. It's like a colour chart.
Yeah, so you use the colour to tell you something about the water. Now, satellites are really, really quite clever at figuring out what that colour means. And there's lots of different ways that we can use methods to tell us what that colour is. And we can get very, very clear data on that, to the point that we can say that that green water has this amount of chlorophyll in it.
Okay.
And that can come from satellite data. So satellite data has been a real game changer here, because we can have data every day for all year, give or take the days when it's cloudy in the UK. So maybe not so much.
Brilliant. So thank you for explaining that. I really like the idea that there's a colour chart. So I guess I want to come to you now, Andy, just to talk about mitigating against those inputs of pollution. So what are the ways that you can action stopping some of these impacts, stopping them at source?
Probably the thing that drives the most changes is if there's a change in economics of industry that makes people shift to a different way of doing things. The next strongest thing is probably government policy change. So there is damage to the environment that drives government's policy changes that in some way reduce the amount of that particular chemical reaching the environment, or the way it reaches the environment. And so those are the strongest ways.
I would actually say that some of the biggest changes have happened because of government regulation. That is the single biggest thing that can happen. And a really good example of this is phosphorus. we have seen a dramatic reduction in phosphorus over the last 20 years. And that is because there's been improvements in the sewage treatment plants to take the phosphorus out of the water. But we've also seen an active campaign to reduce phosphorus in fertilisers and in our washing detergents. So in some ways, that's still, the people at home are very much they're still part of it, because they're going to, if you choose products that have less of something, that's going to be really good. But the phosphorus was a regulation, so the industry had to follow it. Phosphorus was reduced, clothes stayed clean, it was all still good. And over 20 years, that's been probably one of the biggest success stories, is that phosphorus has been reduced in all of the rivers, both here in the UK and through Europe, and actually through the world as well. So when we do have appropriate regulation and people are on board and we have good communication, I think that's where we see the biggest changes.
Being aware of what pollutants are doing to the environment, how we detect them, how we can monitor them, and how we need to action change to reduce our impact, that's going to be based around knowledge. So people listening to the podcast are going to be able to know more about pollution and understand how we're detecting it and resolving some of the issues. Brilliant. Well, it's nearly the end of our episode, so it's time for our fun facts. Now, this is a feature at the end of the episode that is a conversation starter or something that we can discuss what we've learned on the episode today. So, Andy, I'm going to come to you first about your fun fact for the end of this episode.
Okay, so one of the parts of my job is working in a number of different countries around the world with partner governments, trying to understand whether we can work with them to come up with different ways of monitoring. And quite often they don't have any ecotoxicology capability because it's seen as a bit of a luxury item and it can be quite expensive. But we have Ecotoxicology lab in a suitcase that we take on planes with us. We can turn up and we can run this on battery power at the side of a river or on the boat or on a beach. Light producing bacteria that was isolated from the gut of a squid about 30 years ago.
What?
And you add this bacteria to your sample, and if it grows happily, it produces more light, and you measure the light output in a luminometer. And if the water is toxic in any way, it grows less and the light output drops, and you can measure that with your luminometer. And so we're using this 30-plus-year-old culture of bacteria to help us to understand pollution around the world.
Ecotoxicology suitcase.
Yeah.
So I'd like to come on to you now, Michelle.
Okay, my fact would be, which we've mentioned many times through the podcast, is that pollution doesn't stop at a single boundary, and that the only way for us really to combat pollution is to work collaboratively. And I think that it's a really interesting set of partnerships that need to happen, because not only do we need to work with all the different countries under some of those environmental directives we talked about and the environmental programs, but we also need to work from the very top of the catchment, so the very top of the river, all the way down to the sea. And so you start to think about farmers and fishermen that really need to come together, and we need to talk about how the farms affect the fish, how can fishermen actually work with the farmers and make sure that everything is in balance. So I think that marine pollution, while it has many issues and is really something we need to fix quite urgently, I think it also offers us an amazing opportunity for lots of different people and lots of different stakeholders to work together, and for us to find ways to work in areas that we haven't thought, partnerships that we haven't thought of before. And then I think we can do all of this with also thinking about those nature-based solutions. So using nature and using partnerships, and that is the way that we will figure out a way to fix marine pollution.
And keep that balance in check.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I've had a really interesting episode with you today, talking about quite a difficult topic in terms of pollution. So I want to thank you for your time today. I've really enjoyed it, and I really like the idea of where we're going, what we're aiming for, and how we keep taking action against human-based pollution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was made by CFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. To keep up to date with us, follow us on social media using @CEFASGovUK. We hope you can join us again next time.